by this mid-October, we will have WTO's Trade Council meeting. And as you all know that for the last 1 year, in October, it has been entire 1 year since the governments of the world are discussing TRIPS waiver. So there is, while there is a lot of talk about vaccines and inequality surrounding it, and within governments also there is in general more push for maybe vaccines and talking about that in negotiations and discussions. It is important that we talk about therapeutics and diagnostics because they are as important. We know that as the variants change and they with that Delta variant, we have seen that how other tools have failed. It is the therapeutics and medicines which can come to save people. So there are medicines are going to be important. They will continue to be important. Also with comorbidities, things become more complicated. Therefore, they will be important. And diagnostics, of course, because we need to diagnose people with COVID and diseases. So that is the context in which today's webinar is happening. And we have a very good panel which will reflect on different aspects of this entire gamut of things and the debate and discussions happening, and where should we stand when we want to stand with people, and we want to ensure that everybody should be able to access these therapeutics and diagnostics for COVID as and when they are being researched, and what kind of barriers exist for people not being able to access them. We have Krista from MSF Access Campaign. She is pharmacist coordinator with the Access Campaign, and she will be looking at different therapeutics that have, which are there and what is their importance. And MSF, as we all know, is a treatment provider in close to 70 countries and maybe more. And in COVID, they have been working since last year. So we will get a very informed perspective from the treatment provider, from the treatment providers who are looking at access issues there, and also the science of it. And with the new drug Molnupiravir now being talked about, I think it is good that we are talking about it right now. Then we also have Michelle Giles from DNDI. She is Policy and Advocacy Director with the organization. And again, DNDI has been very actively working since last year, not only in research for for therapeutics, but also in bringing together different stakeholders in various developing countries to be able to provide affordable care. So Michelle will touch upon some of those points. We have Reshma Ramachandran. She is a civil society representative and also talks at policy in the US and a very active member of the civil society members group there. So welcome to our panelists. And I think we will begin with Krista from MSF. And I will not take much time now. Krista, maybe you can share your slides and I'll put off my video meanwhile. And just to our participants, if you have questions, please put your questions in Q&A. We will be taking them up as you write them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Yotsna. Just start I hope you can see my slides. So I've been asked to speak about COVID therapeutics in the context of MSF operations and medical guidance. So I'm going to give a quick overview of them, a very light stroke on their evidence, but more focusing on access challenges and the actual procurement issues that we've had when trying to, procure these therapeutics, and just acknowledging my colleagues there who are also attending the forum and can help with any sort of specific, more technical questions. So just a quick overview of some of the key COVID-19 therapeutics. As people know, we had a bit of a dry pipeline for many, many months, but now it's quite busy, and more are being very good evidence for some of these therapeutics that we will review. I'm going to talk about the access challenges and overcoming patent barriers. So starting with the interleukin-6 inhibitors, tocilizumab and sarilumab, these are, as you know, repurposed monoclonal antibodies that have been already approved and used for many years in different autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, as well as cancer therapy. They have come out with a strong recommendation in the WHO living guidance for COVID treatment for severe critical patients on oxygen, resulting in decreased deaths and less need for mechanical ventilation. There are many countries where they have been approved and have been included in some major guidelines around the world. We haven't seen many risks in the randomized controlled trials for COVID-19. Specifically, there was a large meta-analysis of 27 RCTs reviewed by WHO, which led to their inclusion in the guidance. There are many access challenges with tocilizumab, and I mean, essentially speaking from our experience, MSF has not been able to procure the forecasted 6,000 vials that we will need for our projects. That's a 3-month forecast. We have engaged many times with Roche and through the ACT-A consortium, UNITAID and WHO, and still have hit a dead end with respect to actual procurement. So Roche is the manufacturer and the patent holder for tocilizumab. I'm going to focus on tocilizumab because that is the more recommended one and the one that we have primarily included in our guidance. We know there's a biosimilar that has emergency use authorization in India from Hetero Biopharma, and there are many other biosimilars under development. Just from quick search, we found at least 10 that are under development but not yet registered or unknown status of their clinical development. Roche has said from the beginning that they would never be able to meet the demand that would come with COVID. And they say that they're facing a global stockout, but we don't hear many high-income countries really complaining. So we know where the shortages lie, and that is with countries in low and middle-income countries and low resource settings, where there's really very little access to tocilizumab at a baseline. Our teams in India have been trying to pursue through the government mechanism for procurement of tocilizumab, but it has been rationed and not yet possible to procure through those mechanisms. Roche is allocating somehow on a 6-week basis to avoid hoarding, but they say that the future allocation framework will be better, but we don't have any visibility on that. Also, their manufacturing capacity is quite unclear, but we know that contract manufacturers are coming soon, and then they claim that they will reach 3 million dose production per year. The patents expired in 2017, but there are secondary patents having been filed, although Roche has announced that they would not assert their patent rights in low and middle income countries. We have asked them to not assert their patent rights anywhere because this leaves out key manufacturing countries, but they have not responded to that request. The price per dose historically for rheumatoid arthritis indications is anywhere from $600 to over $3,000 per dose. While we know the cost of production studies that have been done on monoclonal antibodies in general would estimate that with large scale production, you could get a cost of production of $60 per dose of 600 milligrams. Finally, I know you probably can't see that, but that is the list of countries where tocilizumab is not registered around the world. And this is a list of countries for which Roche has requested to work with ACT-A to help them where there is no regulatory approval, meaning ACT-A could respond to requests from these particular countries and help them import, perhaps through an import waiver or other regulatory exceptions. This is not yet confirmed or in the public domain, but apparently there are only few vials from Roche for these 58 plus countries and island states. And if you recall, we have, just as MSF, have forecasted for 6,000 vials or for the next 3 months. So you can see this is a very small amount for this number of countries. Also, the price per vial is still not confirmed or public. There's talk about different prices, tiered prices, and a low, quote unquote, lower access price for these low and middle income countries. But it's not been put into the public domain and is done through bilateral negotiations with Roche and the ACT-A consortium. Moving on to the neutralizing antibodies, the casabirumab and indemnimab, which you would have heard about recently because they were also added as WHO recommended therapies in their living guidance for COVID therapeutics for two groups of patients: early disease with risk factors and severe critical disease when seronegative. So those are patients who haven't yet mounted their own antibody response. This is a combination of mAbs by Regeneron, but they have licensed Roche to supply and price this combination cocktail outside of the US. There are a number of approvals around the world, and it also has been included in major guidelines beyond the WHO. And there's quite a range of doses, all the way up even to 8 grams, which has been studied. And obviously, as you know, the higher the dose, the higher the cost, because these are really based on cost per gram of manufacturing costs. The access situation is that most doses, 3 million so far, have been bought up by just a few countries. I mean, the USA has bought up already 3 million doses, about 2,000 per treatment. This is not data specifically from Regeneron, but just through media reports. Again, not in a very transparent process. We have poor visibility also on the manufacturing from Regeneron for low and middle income countries, but there's really no clarity on these procurement channels specifically, or how allocation would be done. And there is not being a repurposed medicine, there's not a repurposed biologic, there's not yet any indication of biosimilars under development. Just quickly on the Janus kinase inhibitors, baricitinib and tofacitinib. And maybe Lena, you might want to put in the chat that there's just been a blog post that covers all of these issues done by Lena and Julian, one of our medical advisors. So Lena can put the link to that in the chat. These are still under evaluation at WHO, so they've not yet been added to the living guidance, but there are approvals around the world and also included in some of the major guidelines, excuse me, for severe cases. These are also repurposed medicines. So they have been used for other indications like rheumatoid arthritis and other immune diseases. We do have generics of baricitinib, both in India and Bangladesh, but there are still access issues for baricitinib. We have not yet tried to procure because we're waiting for WHO guidance to be able to assess it for MSF guidance. But basically, they have an EUA, an emergency use authorization from the FDA since July. Previous to that, they also had an EUA for use with remdesivir, but now it has been proven to be effective without remdesivir. This is for hospitalized patients as well. Eli Lilly holds the patent, and it is widely patented, or its patent is pending in many countries that have been hit hard by the pandemic. These patents expire in 2029 and could be extended further in countries that have patent term extension. It's patented in India as well, but they've granted a license to a number of generic companies to produce locally. This voluntary license means that generics can't be exported to other countries where it's also needed, which is obviously a big barrier. The generics that are already available under this license have significantly lower prices than what Lilly has priced their product at. So about 54 cents per tablet versus $44. Bangladesh is also an important generic source for other countries. But again, patents may be the access barrier there. And finally, just a quick note on molnupiravir, because we have a lot of information has been coming out about this one just this week. We've been following it for a while, but we're happy to read the press release from Roche last week on the positive trial results that came out from their phase 3 trial that looked at the reduced risk of hospitalization or death by around 50%. So this is a Merck and Ridgeback licensed small molecule medicine, so taken by mouth, and thus, potentially much easier to procure and manage than the monoclonal antibodies for similar indications, which have to be given by IV or sub-Q injection. It was originally developed by Emory University with public funding from the US government. It can be quite interesting, perhaps, for a test test and treat strategies. So this is where the importance of the access to diagnostics as well comes in very importantly. And there is already, when we talk about procurement, already a large supply deal with USA. If it is FDA approved, they're going to go for an EUA perhaps this month. And they have already bought up, almost 3 million treatment courses of the Merck product. So the pricing is a great example of pandemic profiteering in this case. The Merck price has been set for a 5-day regimen treatment course at about $700 US, and this is based on the procurement, the first procurement that the US government did. And then we have Indian generics that are not part of the voluntary license that I'm going to mention in the next slide, that are producing already and are expecting, they haven't set the price, but the media and some of the interviews reveal that it should be around, give or take, $13 US per 5-day regimen. And then we have just the other day, the cost of production study that came out of, excuse me, Harvard by Melissa Barber and Zinthars Gautam about US $20 cost of production information, including a profit margin and taxes in India as per their methodology. So yes, Merck has granted a non-exclusive voluntary license to 8 Indian generic companies. No other generic companies in any other countries have been part of this voluntary license. And they say that this will cover over 100 low and middle income countries. And some of them, including Hetero, may be filing for an emergency use authorization this month. Outside the VL, it seems a lot more interesting. They will have freedom to operate to countries without patents, or where there are patents via compulsory license or through use of the TRIPS waiver if it passes. So we know a couple of these companies, Optimus and Natco, and there are more that also may be ready to file for, they're doing their phase 3 trials and may be filing at the Indian regulator for an EUA also this month. So they may be kind of neck and neck with the release of the Merck product itself, and it will be very interesting to follow how this pricing goes. Lena has gathered this patent status information. Lena and Roshan in our India office have gathered this patent status information in countries where it's granted, in many countries more that where it's been filed and is still pending. In India, it's being opposed, I believe, by Third World Network. And then, so that's for its analogs, and its use case patent as well. The applicant is as well Emory University. So one of the asks of civil society could be towards Emory University to halt the process of these patent filings. And finally, that's my last slide. Some of the options of overcoming patent barriers, looking at those bad voluntary license practices, and where's the opportunity here for the TRIPS waiver. So much talk on the TRIPS waiver has been to date on vaccines and to some extent diagnostics. We've had less opportunity to think about it in the context of therapeutics, but here we have some perfect examples of how, given the problems of access and patent barriers and the problematic voluntary licenses that are on the table, where the role of the TRIPS waiver could come in. So there is obviously also other options like patent opposition, which we know has to be done country by country. There's always a risk of failure. It takes a long time and a lot of technical and financial resources to do these filings and oppositions. The voluntary license approach that we have seen now via Merck, and to some extent Eli Lilly as well, these are these bilateral approaches that just continue to feed into the monopoly situation. It excludes producers and other manufacturing countries where they have already manufacturers that are ready and capable to produce these types of medicines. And again, not. So the question to the MPP is that will they go beyond these bilateral licenses to include all territories globally, including all, obviously, low and middle income countries. So there are some talks going on between Merck and the MPP, and we hope that that license would be better than the current voluntary license. The TRIPS waiver obviously would allow countries to export and import generics without any fear of, state-to-state dispute settlements or infringement claims regarding pending patent applications, and always possible involving new patent applications and other IPs. And then the compulsory license is also an option. Again, though, it's country by country and sometimes difficult to assess pending applications and what is incoming as well. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. And thank you so much for telling us about the IP barriers to therapeutics and the fact that in TRIPS waiver, we are not concentrating on it as much as we should, as in the governments and people who are negotiating are not concentrating as much as they should be doing it. So with this, I move to our second panelist, Michelle Giles. As I said, she is Director of Policy and Advocacy with the DNDI. And Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Great. And thanks for that really great presentation from Krista. I mean, for those who don't know, as DNDI, we are a not-for-profit research and development organisation who are trying to develop new treatments for neglected populations suffering from infectious diseases. And what we were kind of asked, I think, to do today was to really give some highlights from our experience as an R&D organisation, and also to take out some of the headlines from a recent policy report which we issued. And the reason that we called this another triumph of science, but a defeat for access, is that we wanted to really focus on what we see as a very narrow window of opportunity in relation to COVID-19 treatments, to kind of learn some of the positive lessons that we have seen from the early stages of COVID-19 and to avoid some of the problems. And the positive ones are that, there has been a big global response and there's been a lot of funding, which has enabled major scientific progress. And we've seen the rapid development of vaccines and some diagnostics. And that has the potential to transform just not COVID, but also other infectious diseases. But we've accelerated to the status quo, which we're calling in the report the unfinished business in global health of ensuring equitable access. And we're seeing this in relation to the vaccine apartheid that we're seeing. And we're also seeing lack of access to diagnostics for a variety of reasons. And we want to see if we can avoid that in relation to therapeutics. And as Krista has explained, we're already starting to see some of the concerns that we saw in relation to vaccines, where there is the potential both for IP barriers, but also for pre-purchase agreements and hoarding from high-income countries. So what could be done? I mean, I think it's worth emphasizing that, of course, vaccine equity is the defining challenge, but we need therapeutics for all stages of COVID, not just because of the lack of vaccine access to vaccines, but also for those people who can't or won't take vaccines, and also for the possibility of vaccine evading mutations. While we need these sorts of treatments for all types of COVID, there is a particular need to look at developing therapeutics for people with mild to moderate COVID, particularly in countries or regions which have very limited intensive care units, because you want to try to avoid the disease progression and therefore them having to be hospitalized. And that's why there's been such a lot of interest, as Krista has highlighted, in the news this week from Merck, that there is a potential antiviral that could be given at early stage, which could potentially stop disease progression. We have to be careful that we don't enter into science by press release, and we need to see the details, they need to be published. But it shows that although at the beginning there has and there still remains insufficient political and financial attention paid to therapeutic research, we are starting to see some potentially interesting treatments come down the pipeline. But The research is still fragmented and it's focused primarily on high-income countries. Even the Merck drug is really focused on a limited subset of people. We've also seen that some of the bodies that were set up internationally to try to accelerate development and delivery, although important, such as the Therapeutic Partnership at ACTA, have really not yet been able to really focus on some of the IP barriers. And then lastly, it's unclear if treatments which are developed will be affordable and more importantly, that there'll be sufficient supply. So just for DNDI's role, as was mentioned, I mean, we have set up a coalition. We are also really coordinating AntiCov, which is a multi-country adaptive platform trial in 13 African countries, where we're seeking to test both repurposed and potentially antivirals to see whether they work in this environment. We're also involved in upstream open drug development, which I'll come back to, as well as advocating. And we have from the beginning advocated that COVID-19 tools should be developed as far as possible as global public goods, because we have seen as DNDI that IP can act as a barrier both to development and to access. So if you are looking at COVID-19 treatments, what are some of the questions if we're worried that although you might get some of these treatments being developed, how can we ensure access to them? And Krista has touched on a few of those, but I wanted to bring out some things that perhaps people don't really focus on. Firstly, is when you're looking at the treatments, you have to ask yourselves, will they be developed for and fitted for remote and resource limited settings? And although the Merck drug is interesting, it's predicated on the fact that you'll be able to have rapid diagnostic tests and get people on treatment within 5 days. And that may not be possible in a number of resource limited settings, which means that you're going to be looking to need probably a combination of drugs, which may be an antiviral and maybe an immune suppressing drug. And the problem with that is that traditionally companies have been unwilling spontaneously to collaborate, to share their drugs, to test them in combination. And we've seen that both in HIV and in hepatitis, where combination drugs were needed. So there's a real question about whether IP or other barriers would stop the ability for combinations to be tested and developed. The other issue is, are diagnostics going to be available? Test and Treat is working on the basis that you have access to rapid diagnostic tests. And we are seeing already that there is a huge disparity between the availability and use of rapid diagnostic tests. The variety of reasons for that, not all of them are linked to intellectual property. It's partly to do with the lack of certainty over guidelines and availability of use, but it is still something that needs to be addressed. And then, as Krista has highlighted, although it's welcome to see that there are some voluntary licenses, as we have seen before with hepatitis, where we have a program to try to develop a affordable HCV combination, the voluntary licenses tend to exclude the same countries, particularly middle-income countries, who have the ability also to manufacture and help themselves. So we really need to find a way to ensure that there is access for those countries. So in the policy report, we've set out ways in which you could immediately course correct to try to deal with some of these potential access issues, both for development and for later stage access. There is a critical role for governments and for all stakeholders, and they are really in 3 areas. Firstly, that governments, particularly those that fund R&D, need to use their leverage to negotiate terms and conditions, put strings to the money, and where they have already funded and there are potential terms and conditions, that they actually exercise them to ensure sharing of research data, to allow the collaborations that I've talked about, and also to ensure sufficient supply and allocation. The other point, which we've been talking about today, is that it's very important that governments support the temporary waiver, but that waiver, it does not just cover vaccines, but it covers therapeutics, diagnostics, and all of the health tools. I think it's not unsurprising that South Africa and India, countries that have had experience of dealing with infectious diseases, put forward this proposal, because they recognize that with any infectious disease, you need to have all of these tools. And so it's important that that is there. It's important that it covers the ability to ensure combinations. And I think one of the points, it depends on the technology, is that an IP waiver, maybe the thing that needs to be lifted to ensure that you can have scale up, because there are a number of companies which we've seen with antivirals who may not need technology transfer, but may be actually intimidated about scaling up because of the fear of legal repercussions because of the monopolies from IP. And then finally, companies themselves also should be looking to share their IP. The concern is that a number of companies have rejected the possibility of sharing their IP, or have done so in a limited way. And a number of companies who have promising therapeutics in the pipeline have, certainly in relation to vaccines and more generally, said that they wouldn't support voluntary licensing mechanisms like the medicines patent pool. So it's important that governments have all of the tools that they need in order to be able, if necessary, to lift these barriers. And as Krista has said, as we've seen with hepatitis, it's very difficult to have a country-by-country approach. The other point, I think, with COVID-19, and which is why we as DNDI talk not about individual drugs, but about treatments, is that you're likely, as I've said, to need combinations and to have a variety of treatments. So a waiver which covers all necessary treatments is a quicker and easier way to ensure access, rather than going by a CL, which is drug by drug. And then finally, I wanted to just highlight a kind of that there is a different way of approaching drug development. And this is something that we're involved in, called the COVID moonshot, which was set up by a group of academics. And interestingly, they started saying that this should be an open science project because of necessity. They wanted to move quickly, and they wouldn't have time to negotiate all of the agreements and to lift any intellectual property barriers. So they agreed to work together in an open science approach, but they have now agreed as a central part of this project that they want to see if they can develop a new antiviral which is going to be IP free, so that it could be direct to generic from the start, and ensuring that it can be equitably and affordably available as a global public good. And we're involved in trying to see whether this can be accelerated and developed. I think it's important to point out that this involves a number of institutions from countries that are blocking the waiver and from countries all over the world. And it shows that there is a clear role for research institutes, but also funders, both public and private, to support ways in which you can remove IP barriers and to develop and to ensure treatments that can be global public goods. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. This was very informative and really happy to see the kind of collaborations which are possible and they are happening. I would now call Reshma Ramachandran. She is physician fellow at the Yale National Clinician Scholars Program, and as I said before, a leading voice in policy in the US. Reshma, and please keep your video on when you present your slides. That's all. Thank you. Reshma, over to you.
Yeah, Michelle, would you mind? Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna share screen. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me as part of this panel. I'm going to specifically be speaking around the role of U.S. public investment into the development as well as production and procurement of COVID-19 therapeutics, and touching upon diagnostics just a bit, mostly to talk about how this might relate to enabling equitable access, and the reasons why a waiver will be crucial in terms of enabling such access worldwide. Here are my disclosures. I don't have any relevant financial relationships. I do sit on the board for Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which has done a mapping project of looking at public investment for different COVID-19 health technologies. And I'll put a link in the chat after the presentation for everyone who might want to take a look afterwards. So I think Michelle touched upon this in terms of why therapeutics and diagnostics are a critical part of building an arsenal against COVID-19. From a clinical perspective, we are seeing a number of patients here in the United States that are unvaccinated or undervaccinated. Those populations that are immunocompromised, that have not yet received, for instance, a booster vaccination, in which they are at risk for COVID-19 and are getting COVID-19 and are coming to our clinics and hospitals. And therapeutics and diagnostics play a key role in terms of being able to have a tool to be able to treat these patients. In addition to that, obviously, with the continued emergence of variants, one concern that has emerged is whether or not the vaccines that we have today will be effective against these variants. And we've seen waning vaccine efficacy amongst different products that we do currently have available in the face of the Delta variant. And of course, obviously, inequities in terms of access to vaccines that are also driving the need for having available therapeutics across all stages of COVID-19. And so the United States, along with other multilateral organizations and other governments, recognized that public investment is not just needed for vaccines, although a bulk of the monies did go into that, but also for therapeutics and diagnostics. We've seen significant investment into R&D, production, and procurement of these various products. Last year, as of October 2020, there was nearly $3 billion that was allocated for COVID-19 therapeutics just through one government program, which was Operation Warp Speed. Since then, there's been a number of other multi-billion-dollar agreements for procurement of doses for various therapeutics, and we anticipate that there will be continued public investment in this space. In addition to that, we also had different government agencies that were engaged in research and development to hasten the development as well as the approval of these different products. The National Institutes of Health set up a program called the Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics Program, in which they invested not just funding, but also significant resources and personnel, their clinical trials network, to work alongside different academic and industry partners to develop both rapid diagnostics as well as PCR tests. On top of that, the National Institutes of Health also set up another program called the Acceleration COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines Initiative, or the ACTIVE Initiative, which has played a central role across really all available therapeutics in terms of fast-tracking clinical trials for these different types of products. The FDA, as a regulator, has also engaged in the development process of this, again, allocating resources and personnel towards hastening the review of these different products through their own CTAP program. So this is a different CTAP than what has been set up by the WHO, but the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program. And you can see here on the right side of this diagram, just a number of products that the FDA has been working alongside different manufacturers, different institutions, in terms of being able to make sure along the drug development pipeline that the review process can be further expedited. So this is just a general overview here in terms of the amount of, or the kind of the role of U.S. government funding. On the left side, in terms of the drugs and biologics, these are the products that have been so far either authorized or approved by the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States. And you can see here, for all of these, there's been funding from the US government, both through Operation Warp Speed, from BARDA, but also other government agencies, including NIH and the Department of Defense. A number of these products, as mentioned before, are repurposed products, and I'll go into a couple of these into more detail. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to kind of skip ahead to molnupiravir and just talk about that in terms of the amount of US government investment and also US ownership or claims that they have to the intellectual property. I'm very glad that Michelle put the caveat of not doing science by press release. There is some obviously promising results that are coming out through the press releases, but the reality is that we have no preprint publication, we have no peer-reviewed publication, and no trial data that's been released. So we are not sure exactly what the results are for this product, what sorts of adverse events might result as a use of this product. And in addition to that, what specific patient populations will this product be indicated for or showing effectiveness for? So I just didn't want to put it out there that there's still a lot of uncertainty despite the promising results. And I think that's important in terms of thinking about procurement decisions ahead of those results coming forward. But just a little bit of background, this was a product that was initially discovered at Emory University through significant NIH funding. It was licensed then to a nonprofit organization within Emory University called the Drug Innovation Ventures, or DRIVE, in 2017. And these initial grants were again funded through the National Institutes of Health, as well as another government agency called the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Exclusive licensing agreements were then given to a smaller pharmaceutical company called Ridgeback Pharmaceuticals, based in Miami, Florida, which then gave exclusive rights to Merck. And in June of 2021, the US government signed a $1.2 billion deal for 1.7 million courses at an estimated $700 per course. And as mentioned before, Melissa Barber and Dinsor Gotham had done a production cost estimate with 10% margins showing at about $200 or $20 per course. We've talked about some of the limitations of the voluntary licenses for this product, but you can see here just a significant amount of US public monies that have gone to the development of this drug all across the development pipeline, all across development course. And the fact that the US government does have claim over a number of the key patents underlying this drug as well. I just also wanted to put this out here in terms of monoclonal antibodies. This was mentioned before, the shortages that have been seen by MSF and also in other low middle income countries. This is from the FDA as of last night. There does continue to be shortages for different types of monoclonal antibodies, including tocilizumab, which is indicated for COVID-19. So these shortages are being present in, across the board, across countries. So just to kind of wrap this up, I know given that we have limited time, just talking about kind of the importance of the waiver for therapeutics and diagnostics. We have been seeing continued supply shortages, including in high income countries. Remdesivir, for instance, last summer, we saw a shortage there as well. This is obviously rectified over time. And currently we're seeing this with monoclonal antibodies. So the idea for the TRIPS waiver being an effective tool to overcome these supply shortages, not for globally, for low middle income countries, importantly, as they face access challenges to vaccines and are seeing continued surges of COVID-19, as well as in high income countries where it's needed. In addition to that, the failure of the global health charity model, given that the limited supply that we do have of current therapeutics, and that there might be anticipated challenges with that in the future, that we do need to make sure that there is going to be equitable and adequate supply for countries worldwide, and that countries, low middle income countries in particular, are not pushed into the back of the line as we've seen with vaccines. On top of that, the limitations of voluntary licenses that we've talked about, the idea that we are still ceding monopoly control for publicly funded therapeutics to just a few manufacturers when there is a need for ample supply worldwide, including for those countries outside of the scope of voluntary licenses, I think is critically important. And that's where, of course, the TRIPS waiver can play a crucial role in terms of not only opening up supply, but also ensuring affordability and accessibility for countries worldwide. The last part I do want to bring up here is, one thing that we've been thinking about from a research perspective is the lack of active comparator trials we're seeing for therapeutics, especially as countries have limited, public health budgets for procurement of various types of products. And even though, a number of countries do have mechanisms to allow for these active comparator trials, especially for products that are still under IP protection, such as through research exemptions, whether or not, the waiver can help remove the chilling effect of actually doing these trials, and also to overcome maybe the issues around, procuring a very costly branded comparator for these trials as well. I think this is very, important, especially with what we saw with remdesivir. Remdesivir has now been accepted across countries, including here in the United States, as a part of the standard of care, despite limited evidence of its efficacy. We've had a study that was just released recently from the Veterans Affairs Hospital that didn't show significant benefit in terms of reducing hospitalizations for patients that had severe COVID-19, despite it actually being approved for that indication. So I think there is a need to think about how the TRIPS waiver can be used to also enhance our decisions about procurement and the types of products that we want to make sure are safe and effective as countries are making these decisions and allocating their limited public health budgets for obtaining these types of important health technologies. And I'll just leave this quote here. I think this applies not just to vaccines, but definitely to therapeutics and diagnostics, that doses are charity, but knowledge is definitely justice. And so we need mechanisms like the TRIPS waiver to ensure equitable access to the doses now, but also for enabling adequate supply through expanded global manufacturing in the future as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reshma. Thank you so much. And also, bringing about the points regarding molnupiravir and what should we look forward to or not look forward to in that. May I request all the panelists to please put their videos on, and then maybe we can discuss a little, take up some questions. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A session, but I have one other question maybe to begin with, and this is something which has been intriguing me since we started to think about this webinar, which is we all have been talking about vaccine inequity, and there are stories after stories which show how much is Democratic Republic of Congo has been able to access vaccine compared to the developed countries or Africa as a continent. But what about diagnostics and therapeutics? What is our sense in that? On that, we have a publication called the People's Health Dispatch, and some of us looked at diagnostics inequity across the world there, and it was just horrible. It was something, when we started to look at the data, it became a bit unbelievable what's happening. So maybe we can discuss a little bit on those lines, how it is playing out, and through that we can actually impress upon people that how important it is to talk about that also when we talk about TRIPS waiver, how it is not sufficient to talk about vaccines. So any of the panelists can maybe take this. So maybe MSF can talk about the inequity in the, therapeutics, which one is seeing.
Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button. Yeah, I didn't. We're also following on diagnostics, and we have a recent report out on, the opportunities for local production of diagnostics in low and middle income countries. And I was just looking for the link that I can share in the chat as well to contribute to that side of it, because I don't think we've really talked much about diagnostics today. But yeah, I mean, for therapeutics, I mean, we're seeing the need for therapeutics in areas where we don't have access to vaccines. Obviously, vaccines would be ideal because we would rather prevent than have to treat or to cure. And as we see the prices of these therapeutics, vaccines are going to be more affordable than these kind of complex therapeutics, at least some of them, maybe not the new oral small molecule antivirals, but it's a real tension between like fighting for vaccines and then, you know, failing to get vaccines in these populations, and at the same time having no access to therapeutics. So it's like a double whammy of inequity that we're witnessing in our medical projects.
Thank you. Anyone else? Michelle, maybe you would like to add, or even Pascal, is there any of?
So I think in relation to diagnostics, I think data is limited. I mean, there has been some research which shows that the diagnostic rate in low middle income countries is between 0.1 to 15%, and it varies by continent. And, you know, there are a number of reasons for that, as I touched on. I mean, some of that is simply that there was some confusion about the guidelines about whether countries should use it. And there also have been some delays in authorization of some diagnostics, but there is still potentially a need for local production of diagnostics. And I think it's maybe worth underlying the point that if you want to have treatments, particularly for mild to moderate, you need to have access to diagnostics so that you can implement what we call a test and treat, which is that if you test somebody and you know that they have COVID at an early stage, then you can then give them treatment. And the benefit of doing that is to try and avoid hospitalization, particularly in those countries where you have very limited intensive care capacity. So, and, you know, it also, as we've seen with HIV, you know, it then enables potentially for you to do this at a community level, which again reduces the burden on health systems. So, you know, diagnostics are an important component, not just in measuring, you know, the levels of COVID, but also in actually trying to roll out different medical tools. So I think it's important that we focus on both of them. And the other thing is also some people are reluctant to get tested, sometimes because they have to pay for it. But if you are going to then be isolated and there's no possibility of treatment, it can be a disincentive. So there's another benefit in ensuring that we also look at developing treatments.
Thank you. Yeah, very useful. Reshma, I saw that you shared a report maybe by UAM. Would you like to add to this?
Sure. This is just a report I mentioned during the talk of a mapping of public investment for different COVID-19 health technologies. So you'll see obviously a number of universities, but obviously government agencies that have contributed to the development of vaccines, diagnostics, as well as therapeutics. And I think this is a key tool in terms of asking for a fair return on this public investment. And that means having adequate supply and also an affordable price. And I think there's a couple of questions in the chat, so we can start, given that we have, I think, limited a time, we can maybe jump into them. So I think one of the questions was around the United States, asking just for the waiver for vaccines, is that enough to combat COVID-19? And also, you know, surely we can't expect the US to accept TRIPS exemption out of magnanimity. So what does it gain by it, and what is the game about? So I'll address those together. I think during the talk, I think one of the things that we talked about is, you know, the limitation of the COVID-19 or the TRIPS waiver for just vaccines is not sufficient, especially given that we're seeing the access disparities that we see with vaccines being reflected with therapeutics and also diagnostics around the world. And especially as countries are facing COVID-19 unprotected, without, you know, the availability and without really a near-term timeline of actually having sustainable or adequate access to the vaccines. So it's the waiver, you know, having it expanded to therapeutics and diagnostics is just critical. For the United States itself, this is similar issues that we're seeing also in the setting of having significant numbers of people in the United States also being unvaccinated or under-vaccinated. You know, we're having ICUs across the country that are being filled with patients. It's kind of ebbed and flowed over time, but certain places are worse than others. And we've been kind of in the thick of having patients coming into our clinics, also with symptoms, having these breakthrough infections as well, or just, you know, choosing not to be vaccinated and contracting COVID-19. So in the setting of those, you know, situations, and as a clinician, needing to have tools in our tool chest of therapeutics and diagnostics is going to be imperative. And the United States, in terms of seeing shortages for a number of these products throughout this pandemic, the waiver could be a helpful tool for high-income countries, including the United States, to be able to access these different types of technologies from other countries, from other manufacturers. It's in the US's and other high-income's best interest to actually rapidly expand global manufacturing capacity to meet the needs of the pandemic, and not to, not to stifle the amount of supply, and then also kind of be held hostage by companies in terms of pricing as well. These countries are facing kind of similar challenges, just in varying degrees, but for high-income countries, there should be a motivation and an incentive if they're serious about addressing this pandemic.
Thank you, Reshma. Would you like to take any other question also from the Q&A session? Otherwise, I'll ask the other speakers. Fine. So Pratibha is asking, yeah.
I think there was a direct question to me about the COVID moonshot and open science, which I'd just like to answer publicly. I mean, I thought it's a combination. So what you have seen on that map is the original people who responded to a tweet to ask to help. And so some of that is a reflection of the resources that they had. But the point about the Open Science Project is that all of the data is being made publicly available. So we are hoping that other institutions around the world will be able to contribute and to use this information. So that's really why it is as it is at the beginning, but there are other institutions that are joining, and we're also, making this information available and working with the Covid-19 Coalition of Researchers to also bring other people into this approach.
Thank you. So maybe Krista, before you leave, there's this question on by Pratibha that EU says CL is sufficient, but how effective it is. So maybe you can take this up.
I think Lena answered that one already in the answered section, because I think that question had come twice.
Oh, all right.
So there's a comprehensive answer from Lena there.
Right. So we have the other question. Ethel is saying that I applaud the concept of open science and the COVID moonshot. That's what you talked about just now, right? And so testing is important, but not only access, but the speed of getting the results. So prevention and treatment can be conducted efficiently. I guess this is more of a comment than a question. But maybe we can then talk about TRIPS waiver a little and the question of VL, because it keeps coming up. So even if Lena has answered the EU question, maybe we can just talk about it here so that everybody can hear. Lena, would you like to just answer Pratibha's question here also? You can put your video on.
Yeah, sorry about the video, but yeah, I'm going to try, and yeah, I think I almost succeeded. Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly go into one of the questions that someone had raised about, well, the US is, talking about the waiver in the context of vaccines. And I think this is precisely, the objective behind webinars like this, that what we have learned in our experience is you can't fight infectious diseases simply by going down the route of prevention, and you have to have something that looks at treatment as well. So I think the United States may very well want to limit it to vaccines, but as treatment providers, we cannot draw that as a line. It's a red line for us to have therapeutics in there in the TRIPS waiver. And actually, we would appeal to all countries who have supported the waiver to look at therapeutics much more closely, because that's where a lot of current barriers on intellectual property are now coming into the forefront. So I think that's there. And number two is this, that, today that Economic Times, carried a glowing reference about the voluntary licensing to molnupiravir. And my question to the Economic Times is, to the reporter who carried that, I would say, a really inferior piece of reporting is, have you even looked at the countries that are covered by the voluntary license? And if you haven't seen the voluntary license agreement, how do you attribute what is happening in India to the voluntary license? Molnupiravir is being developed because Indian companies have started to be reassured that the Indian government is serious about non-enforcing intellectual property. And that's why you saw NATCO introducing baricitinib. You saw a number of companies come forward with Molnupiravir, and they are not dependent on any voluntary license. As long as you remove the intellectual property, they can make those treatments. Number two is this, that if you look at the voluntary license itself, the voluntary license territories cover the very countries where there are no patent barriers. So, where there are patent barriers, there are no licenses, there are voluntary licenses. So I think there's a mismatch in the whole strategy on voluntary license. You apply voluntary licenses where there are patents, not to countries where there are no patent barriers. So I think really the voluntary license needs much, much more shredding apart than we have done till now. Yeah.
Thank you. So I see that most of the questions have been answered or being answered. So I'll take the opportunity to ask one more question, which is, beyond TRIPS waiver, what can we do to ensure access to the therapeutics and the diagnostics? That is, of course, the tip of the pyramid. We have to work on TRIPS waiver. We have been doing it for a year. But what else?
I think some of the solutions that have been discussed also for vaccines also applies for therapeutics and diagnostics. The idea of technology transfer, because we've heard from various manufacturers that technology transfer will hasten the development and of being able to produce this in companies outside of the ones that currently own the intellectual property and that are currently controlling the supply of these products. So definitely that. The other part of this too is just having significant public investment in terms of ramping up global manufacturing capacity as well. This also applies for therapeutics. Obviously India has a robust base of this for a number of the antivirals and also biologics, but we also need to be doing this in other countries as well to be able to meet the demand, the global demand for these products. So definitely both of those are imperative for sure. And then there's also the regulatory barriers, having the WHO also have tools to be able to do more quickly rapid pre-qualification of various, products, especially those that are going to be biosimilars and other generic antivirals. We've seen delays for this happening outside of the COVID-19 space, but we need, further investment and also dedication from the WHO to also do this. One thing that we've been curious about, and I think something that a number of folks across civil society have been discussing, is that we have obviously deep pipeline analyses of where clinical trials are being run, what the status is for different types of products for vaccines, but we don't have this sort of tracker for therapeutics as of yet, looking at what the development pipeline across different types of therapeutics are and diagnostics, at least something that's publicly available, as well as looking at what are the access challenges across different countries. And so having that sort of resource can also inform particular strategies for WHO, multilateral organizations, but also civil society to be able to push for a strategic global manufacturing expansion, as well as further investment as well. Michelle, you probably have more to add, so I'll toss it over to you.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I mean, I think that we focused on some of the drugs that have come towards the end of the pipeline, but we also need to recognize that we need continual investment for additional drugs. Before now, there was relatively little investment. And, Reshma spoke about the fact that the US is now investing. And I think that gives an opportunity to do two things. One is to basically say, what terms and conditions should be put on that funding so that we can try and create more collaborative and sharing, and try to avoid some of these problems for the drugs that are coming down the pipeline. The other thing that's been touched on, and obviously this is what we are involved in, is there's also a need for robust testing in where you can really compare the results. I think that's one of the issues around therapeutics. There have been a lot of small trials, and therefore it's been difficult for people to really tell whether these drugs work or not. So I think that there is also a need, upstream for that. And then I think we shouldn't let companies off the hook, in the sense of that they have an obligation and an ability to change the situation. I mean, what we've seen in vaccines is that, basically there's been a very two broad different approaches, with people meeting somewhere in the middle, which is either a very concentrated approach, which is focused on high income countries where you have a few contract manufacturers, and perhaps a more distributed approach. And what we need to see is that companies move further towards a distributed approach that encompasses all of the countries that need it, but that is not just a limited voluntary licensing approach. And because it needs to be on a global basis, and it shouldn't be country by country, then they should be supporting some of the proposals that are out there. So I don't think it's an either or. I think you need both. And there are some positive signs, and I think there needs to be a greater encouragement to do more on this.
Thank you. Thank you to the panelists and the attendees. I think we can wind up now. Thanks, Reshma. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks to Lina and Krista, though they are not on the call anymore. And thank you, Pascal, for responding to many questions which came in Q&A. So I think from now, what we have to look out for, how the TRIPS Council meeting goes next week, and the ministerial conference, which is scheduled for November. And hopefully we'll be able to have some better commitments than what we've seen till now. So that's the thing. And the organizations who are part of this webinar, organizers and panelists, will keep working towards ensuring that how we can fight for access to all types of medical tools for COVID-19. So watch out for further work that everyone does. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.